Welcome to A Pair of Bookends, the book club you can carry anywhere. I'm your host, Hannah MacDonald, and I'll be bookending the conversation with some of the most exciting voices from the bookish world. Welcome back, bookends, to an incredibly exciting bonus books episode. Today, I am honoured to be joined by Kate Mosse to discuss the fourth and final instalment of the CBE Family Chronicles, The Map of Bones. The Map of Bones is a compelling and powerful story of hardship, love and adventure. Kate Mosse, CBE, is an award-winning novelist, playwright, performer, campaigner and non-fiction writer. She's the author of 11 novels and short story collections, including the multi-million selling Languedoc trilogy, the Joubert Family Chronicles, and #1 best-selling gothic fiction, including The Taxidermist's Daughter and The Winter Ghosts. Her books have been translated into 38 languages and published in more than 40 countries. Her highly acclaimed non-fiction includes An Extra Pair of Hands, a story of caring and everyday acts of love, and Warrior Queens and Quiet Revolutionaries, How Women Also Built the World, which inspired her one-woman touring theatre show. As a huge champion of women's creativity, Kate is the founder-director of the Women's Prize for Fiction and the Women's Prize for Non-Fiction, the world's largest annual literary awards celebrating writing by women. Kate is also the founder of the global campaign #Woman in History. Kate was awarded a CBE on the King's New Year's Honours List 2024 for services to literature, women and charity, and was named Woman of the Year for her service to the arts in the Every Woman Awards. Kate is also a trustee of the British Library and an honorary fellow of the Society of Authors. I could go on because there's plenty more, but here to chat with me all about her latest book. Welcome, Kate, to A Pair of Bookends.
It's lovely to be here, Hannah. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Well, I'm quite worn out. You reading all of that out. But then I am quite old. Been around a while, so there's been plenty of years to get some stuff in.
I'm sorry, I just had to give you the intro that you deserve because you've done so many incredible things. But before we dive into your career and you as a writer and your wonderful book, I have to ask the favourite question of listeners, which is, what are you currently reading?
Well, I'm reading two different things because I'm always like this. I always have work things and relaxing things. So one of the books I'm reading is by an extraordinary writer new to me called Kato Pedder, and she has written a book called Motherland, in other words Motherland, and the subtitle is 9 Daughters of South Africa, and it's an extraordinary book about incredible women who made a difference to the history of South Africa. And obviously, as we're about to talk about, my latest novel is set in Southern Africa. I'm also reading, though, which is going to sound very cheeky, I'm rereading my own novel Labyrinth.
I love this.
Because next year will be the 20th anniversary of the publication of Labyrinth. And it was the book that changed my life and changed my family's lives. And I'm doing a new one-woman show touring the country with a show called Unlocking the Secrets of the Labyrinth. And as I sat down to talk to the producers, I realized that I had forgotten a lot of the secrets of the Labyrinth. And I really did need to reread it, having not really looked at it since it came out 20 years ago. So it's quite a salutary experience going back to an earlier novel, because all you can see are the things that you would now edit out or write differently. Yes. So it's been an odd experience.
I can imagine. And that's so exciting that you're touring something new, especially, I mean, going back to a book that was loved by so many people. Where are you touring? Are you allowed to say, or is it kind of not?
Yeah, no, we've just announced the tour. It will be all in theatres all over the UK. So if people go to my website, which is katemosse.co.uk, to events, you'll be able to see all the theatres I'm touring. And it's a 6-week tour in March and April 2025. One night here, one night there, going all over the country. So you can book tickets directly with the theatre. But I'm really excited about doing it because, people still come up to me and say, oh, Labyrinth, it really meant a lot to me. Or I, went there on my honeymoon, or all of these things. And it's very moving as a writer to be told that about people. So to revisit it for one last time feels a very special opportunity.
Yeah, I can imagine. I am definitely going to try and get myself tickets. I'm sure they'll be snapped up very quickly. But I'm hoping that I'll be able to find something close to Manchester. So,
oh yes, absolutely. I'm at the Lowry in Manchester.
Wonderful!
Yeah,
I love the Lowry. Wonderful.
I know. I finished my last tour, the Warrior Queens tour, at the Lowry. My final night was there, and it was packed, and it was just it's such a wonderful theatre, and it was the most fantastic atmosphere. So yes, I'm definitely at the Lowry. I know.
I'm so excited. Okay, I we'll be booking tickets after this.
Excellent.
So, as listeners will have, of course, heard in my intro and with us just speaking just now, you have a truly impressive multi-hyphenate career. How do you carve out time for your writing and to read the amount that you do? Do you have to be quite strict with your routine? How does that work?
Well, I am very disciplined. I think anybody who is a writer needs to do that because it's otherwise, when do you start? It's not that you're due somewhere at a set time with a boss going, it's 9:02, where are you? Why are you late? Sort of thing. But also, I think what you need to be writing, whether it's fiction or non-fiction for me, the emotion of it is the same, is to be quite introspective and in your own head, and you're dreaming of your imaginary friends and the story that you want to tell and the next chapter, the next sentence, all of these things. And that is completely in opposition to what you need to be functioning out in the world, which is to be looking outward rather than inward and listening to yourself. So I do have quite a set year pattern rather than anything else, which is I start writing a new book. I'll be planning and plotting and thinking about it and doing all of those things. But in terms of sitting down to write 8 hours a day, 7 days a week, that starts in June, the day after we have awarded the Women's Prize for Fiction each year. And then I will write all the time, June, July, August, September, and then keep it going all the way, through to the end of the year. I always deliver a book either at Christmas or at the end of February, because that again is when the Women's Prize for Fiction and now the Women's Prize for Non-Fiction picks up. So I have lots of meetings that are going on, for the British Library, obviously for the Women's Prize, for various other things I'm involved with. But I make sure that when I'm out and about being the public face of the Women's Prize for Fiction, the Women's Prize for Non-Fiction, I am not writing then, because my job is to promote other writers then. So it's an annual cycle that I have rather than a weekly one or a monthly one.
That's so fascinating. And I do want to quickly touch on the Women's Prize because it is my favourite literary prize and I look forward to it every year and I'm so grateful for it. What have been your highlights of being the founder director of the Women's Prize?
Well as doing my one-woman show for Labyrinth next year, it will be the 30th anniversary of the Women's Prize for Fiction. Well, the 30th winner will be announcing.
It's incredible.
It is incredible, and it will be the second for the Women's Prize for Non-Fiction, and it will be the 5th year of our huge mentoring and writing programme, Discoveries, which we do with Curtis Brown Creative and Curtis Brown, and is sponsored by Audible. And I think what I most love is looking back on those early days where it was really tough.
Yeah.
And I don't know what it would have been like with social media, with trolling, and the incredible amount of abuse that women face on those online platforms a lot of the time. At the time of setting up the prize, people had to ring my home number, speak to my husband in order to get a chance to abuse me for not being a proper woman or any of these things, which is what happened. People saying that, my husband should keep me in better order and, all of these kind of things. I mean, this is only 30 years ago. So I think looking back on how far we've come and also how the debate and the dialogue around things has changed. There was always this idea that feminism wasn't needed anymore. And consequently, anything that was promoting and honouring and celebrating women was unnecessary. Now, sadly, people realise that is very far from being the case, that anything that women have, they have fought for and it can be taken away. We're seeing that in America, we're seeing that in Afghanistan, in Iran, all over the world, Yeah. But within the much more positive atmosphere, that means, therefore, that people now talk about the Women's Prize as being a beacon of excellence, of every year being told about extraordinary fiction and now non-fiction by women written in English from anywhere in the world. And it was very different when I was launching the Women's Prize for Non-Fiction, that everywhere I went, every radio station, every television station, every journalist said, this is amazing. And when I stand that next to my experience of launching the Fiction Prize 30 years ago, there has been a sea change. So that, I suppose also that going into a bookshop anywhere in the world, randomly picking up a book and seeing the words shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction or winner of the Women's Prize for Non-Fiction. And it's about creating a global community of men, women, everybody reading exceptional work by women. And we've done it. We've done it. And, it has not finished. We are still doing it and will continue to do it because it is about celebration. And so much, particularly at the moment, it's a very challenging world and it's quite an ugly world. So celebrating the best, celebrating excellence, originality, imagination, beauty, women's voices is always a good thing to do because we need to bring joy and light into the world as well.
Absolutely. I think you only need to to look at recent news and, I mean, the history of what it's been like for women, to know that we need to hear women's stories need to be heard, women's voices need to be heard and platformed. And I just think it's so incredible what you do with the Women's Prize and the Women's Prize for Nonfiction this year. It was just so refreshing to see so many incredible nonfiction writers, nonfiction writing by women. It was just so refreshing. So I'm so grateful to you for this. But we must chat about your book because
Yes,
this is what you're here
let me
for.
be an author today. Yes, I could be an author today.
So let's chat about the Map of Bones. And what I said in my intro is that it's the fourth and final installment of the Joubert Family Chronicles. Could you talk us through the seeds of inspiration for this series?
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to do so, because it does feel, with this fourth book, like the end of an era.
Yes.
Actually, I've written a lot in the past few years. I've published 7 books in 6 years. And I never would have thought I could do that, because I'm famously always delivering my books late and, to my publishers and all of these things. But actually, this is the end. The Map of Bones is the end of 12 years of dreaming, planning, researching, editing, writing. And that feels like something. And the inspiration for the series came when I was visiting a book festival back in 2012 in Franschhoek in South Africa. And I had arrived from the airport. I was being driven to the book festival in this lovely town in the Western Cape, about 30k east of Cape Town. And I'd never heard of the town before. And as we drove away, down from the airport, I noticed that we passed a sign at the side of the road that said Languedoc. And it was spelt with a Q, not a G, but it was the same word. And I was confused by this, because Languedoc, of course, is the region of southwest France that has inspired all of my historical fiction, like Labyrinth. And didn't say anything, then kept driving. Then I started to notice that all of the wine farms that we were passing, or at least a lot of them, had French names. Grand Provence, La Rochelle. And I thought, this is very strange. I had no idea there was French history in this part of the Cape. And then we arrive in Franschhoek itself, and the main street is called Huguenot Road. And at that moment, I smelt a rat. And I said to my driver, I didn't know there was a French history. And he looked at me and said, oh, didn't you know that the name Franschhoek means the French corner? And out of that, when I had time, when I wasn't on stage talking about one of my books, I went to the museum at the end of the road, the Huguenot Memorial Museum, and there discovered this piece of history that essentially the commander of the Cape, who ran the Dutch East India Company in the 1650s, he realized that the land in the Cape was very similar to the land in the southwest of France. There were many Huguenot refugees fleeing persecution in France who were in Amsterdam and in other parts of the Netherlands. And he suddenly realized that maybe there might be winemakers, makers of brandy and vinegar as refugees who might come to this brand new colony on the other side of the world. And about 400 Huguenots accepted the invitation. And it's not exclusively because the governor of the Cape, Simon van der Stel, was already making wine, but in large part, the whole of the South African wine industry in those days is on the shoulders of a few Huguenot refugees who were brave enough to go to the other side of the world. And that just blew my mind as a piece of history. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to know all about it. And that, of course, made me want to know about the wars of religion that began in France in 1562. And that, of course, sent me back to my beloved Carcassonne, which is where Labyrinth and Sepulchre and Citadel and the early novels of the Joubert Family Chronicles are set. And out of that came, well, of course, this is a family saga. This is a Romeo and Juliet story, a Catholic girl and a Huguenot boy. Huguenot is simply the French Protestants. It's just the name that's given to the French Protestants. And before I knew it, I had 4 novels in my head, 300 years of history, starting in Carcassonne on the eve of the wars of religion that would destroy France, the civil wars, and ending in southern Africa in 1862 with the consequences of colonization and the theft of the land from the Xhosa and the San people who owned it. And here we are now, 12 years later, many hundreds of thousands of words later. And that is the story of Alaise Joubert and her family.
It's an incredible story, and I finished last night and I just had to sit for a moment when I'd closed the book because it just completely took my breath away. I mean, it's a beautiful ending, and I'm not going to give any spoilers for anybody, but you write in your author's note for The Map of Bones, the influence of the Huguenots is extraordinary, a diaspora that took them as skilled immigrants all over the world, one branch of my family also. Could you tell us about your family connection to Huguenots?
Well, it's one of the wonderful things about being a non-fiction writer as well as a fiction writer is that when you are researching a piece of history, and all of my work is inspired by real history. And in fiction, of course, it's imagined characters set against the backdrop of real history. And in my non-fiction, such as Warrior Queens and to a degree An Extra Pair of Hands, it's about the history that's been lived. But in both cases, your job as a researcher is to be a detective, to track down clues, to follow tiny little references until you little by little build up the full picture. When I published the first in the Joubert Family Chronicles, The Burning Chambers, then The City of Tears, then my pirate novel, The Ghost Ship, and now The Map of Bones. When I started, I would say, well, I don't have any Huguenot ancestry, but I'm just very interested in faith and the consequences of faith, war and the consequences of war, and religious diaspora. But when I was writing my non-fiction book, Warrior Queens and Quiet Revolutionaries, and I was doing research into my own family during lockdown, I discovered completely out of the blue that I did have a little bit of Huguenot history. And it was mind-blowing, actually. I don't believe it. I've been writing about the Huguenots, saying I have no connection, but yet here it is. Now, I have not had time to do much research, and I don't know much more than it is a great-great-great-grandmother was a Lepard, which is a Huguenot name, and came across to the UK in the 18th century, so relatively late into the Huguenot story of the UK. And eagle-eyed readers who know my feminist history book, Warrior Queens, and you clearly noticed it, I have put a bit of my own family history into the ending of this novel. And when I have more time, I will actually do some research into this family. So it's a very tiny glimpse of another bit of history that I didn't know. And that is the joy of being a writer and a joy of historical research.
Absolutely.
And you know what I love about it is, I love that you say you had to kind of sit with the book when you finished, because in some ways the Map of Bones is a love letter to the power of words and writing, and particularly women writing, and women being explorers and women being brave enough to put their thoughts down on paper. And in some respects, that is one of the aspects, although this is an adventure novel and it's several generations of the Joubert women in Southern Africa, some in 1688 and 89 and some in 1862. But at the heart of it is the idea that words are what help women speak to one another throughout the generations.
Absolutely. And there are so many incredible women in this book. I was particularly a fan of Suzanne, and I loved her dynamic with Judith. And I think it's such an achievement to pull off novels with such big casts when the writing of each character is so kind of layered and nuanced, like it was in this book. You really feel like you spend time with these characters and you know them. And I think that was part of me needing a moment when I finished the book, was I felt sad to leave them.
Yes, yes. But you know what, Hannah, I think your listeners might feel the same. In some ways, I think that characters often live longer in the hearts and the minds of readers than they do writers. Because when you've finished a book as a writer, you're proud of it and you're hopefully happy with it. And I love publication. The Map of Bones comes out on the 10th of October, and I'm about to start being on the road for, I'm doing 60 events for this book because I kind of want to say goodbye to the characters properly. But once the publication is over, my head's somewhere else. I'm starting to write the next thing. And because this is the end of a series of 4, it will be very acute. And I know I will have a kind of moment of sadness to say goodbye. But what I've learned, particularly with characters in Labyrinth, and I would say characters in The Ghost Ship as well, readers come up years later and say, oh, I still think about such and such. And I think, oh, that's interesting, because she's very faint in my life now, because my new character is the one that I'm focusing. So I think that's a different dynamic between characters and readers and characters and their writers.
Yeah, you're so right. And I do think these characters will stay with me for a long time. Who do you look to for inspiration when writing character?
Myself and the women of the past.
I love that.
Yes, I'm never looking at other writers and thinking, because that time has passed. Yeah. When I'm reading other writers, I'm there as a reader, and that is my enjoyment. And I can admire huge numbers of people, how they bring their characters to life, and we all do it differently. And the sign of a character is exactly as we're saying, that they live on with you. They are not flat on the page. They feel like they exist in the world with you. And there are huge huge epic characters, iconic characters from literature, of course, that we all still know, whether it's Hercule Poirot or Miss Marple, if you're in that kind of reading, or Emma Bovary, or any character you might mention, they feel like they must have lived. But for me, when I'm writing, the key is that the character reveals herself or himself to me. So if you like, I become a biographer of that character rather than me making somebody up. It always feels the other way round, that I have stumbled upon someone and they are standing there in the wings of a theatre saying, I'm here, Kate, you need to come and tell my story now. So they always feel very separate from me rather than there's somebody that I'm conjuring up out of thin air.
I love that so much. I want to mention a quote, which this is something that is from Suzanne's perspective. And she says she'd rarely known a time in her adult life where she'd slept deeply without fear of what the night might bring. And you celebrate women in this book, and you talk about the power of women, but you also explore a lot of power dynamics and, male violence against women. And I was curious, when you started this, 12 years ago, and as you've been writing it, did you realize how much would resonate with women today?
Oh, that's a really great question, Hannah. Yes and no. Historical fiction, and I write historical adventure fiction, only works, in my opinion, if it is completely rooted in the time and period in which it's set, so that you cannot put 21st century views into the mouths of, 17th century women. It just doesn't work. Their worldview, their attitudes are completely different. However, the human heart doesn't change very much. If you are running for your life and you hear the sound of footsteps behind you, a woman now and a woman then has exactly the same spike of fear. Yeah. So the issue is how you set these things in context. So the writing must be completely authentic to the time period. But at the same time, am I aware that women and indeed men reading it now will respond viscerally and emotionally and with a sense, for most women, of understanding? Then yes, because it's not just the male violence within the book against women, which is endemic. Yeah. And it is now, it's the terrible, that femicide is the untalked about violence in the world. It's like, and you just need to look at in the newspapers when it says woman died after, and you go, no, that's a murder.
Yeah.
It's this kind of thing. And in the past, many of the things that we would take as written now just didn't, the idea that a man did not have the right to beat his wife to death just didn't exist. Mm-hmm. Women were men's property. So it's all of these things, the context, the way that you tell a story. And particularly with this, which is a refugee story, Suzanne is fleeing a terrible experience of her own, and in a way has latched onto the history of a very powerful woman in her family, the pirate Queen Louise, who has last been heard of in Southern Cape in 1622 and then has vanished. And any modern reader will understand that this is trauma, that Suzanne is trying to deal with her own trauma by focusing on a completely different story, going back into her own, to become a detective. I can't use those words because they wouldn't have existed. Suzanne wouldn't be able to identify in the way that we would now. So I rely entirely on the author, the reader, bringing her or his sensibilities, interests, understandings, emotion to the book. And the novel, as you read it and I have written it, becomes a partnership. So that's how it works. It's a partnership between you and me.
And you mentioned the power of words and the importance of language. And it's something that I find really interesting with historical fiction, because language, of course, evolves so quickly, and there's things that we might have said a few years ago that we wouldn't say now. And I was curious, how do you go about finding the balance between writing historical accuracy and truth, and also kind of not offending the modern reader?
Yes, again, that's a really excellent question, and it was particularly pertinent for this novel. Yeah. Because the Dutch East India Company were an extraordinary company. They were founded in 1602. They were the world's first multinational company, the first time really that we see anything other than a nation state or hereditary ruler having absolute power. So they were bigger than Microsoft in their day, and they did some extraordinary things. They also started a slave colony, and they stole and tricked the land from the people who owned it in southern Africa. And we now know this as colonization. And the modern view, rightly, is that this is not a good thing. But of course, the history is nuanced and complicated in the early days. And so it's about going to the people who know. So I spent a lot of time in this book talking and sharing the script with academics and people in South Africa, from all different communities in Southern Africa, so that I could make sure that I was taking that balance. So I have an author's note that explains that the phrase enslaved person would simply never have been used. It is very modern and it sounds clumsy anyway.
Yeah.
So if it is a word in somebody's mouth, character, I will use the word slave. If it is a word in the text, I will use enslaved. So if you like, I acknowledge that the language that was used, we would now see as offensive or dehumanizing, but that if you are trying to create the atmosphere of the 17th century, you have to be very careful to not have anachronistic phrases that just destroy the novel because it doesn't feel like the 17th century anymore. A good example in South Africa is the word Hottentot, which is seen as very offensive now. But there is still a part of South Africa with that in its name. So you have to juggle always when you are writing historical fiction. Be sensitive, do the research, speak to the people who know. I spoke to a lot of academics, Black academics in South Africa, asked for their advice on what to use as language and what to use for the different groupings of people. And then beyond that, you just have to do your best. Respect the past, but respect and acknowledge the present.
Yeah, you do write respectfully and with care and thought, and I want that to be very clear to listeners. But I do think, it's a hard balance to strike for writers. And I love the way you've just explained that. You have, of course, mentioned the many beautiful places that you explore in this novel. So let's talk about setting. I was curious, how do you go about immersing yourself in these places when you're writing at your desk? I mean, it's rainy here in Manchester at the moment. I don't know.
Rainy here in Sussex, yes.
So how do you go about immersing yourself in the world of your books? Like what's important to you when doing that?
Well, all of my writing, fiction and non-fiction and plays, comes from landscape. The first inspiration is always landscape, and the idea that this story can only be told here, that you couldn't pick up this story and set it somewhere else, because landscape, character, mystery, narrative are intertwined for me and indistinguishable in some ways. And of course, this goes back to my very first passion for a novel, which was Wuthering Heights, which is the great landscape novel. And I learned from that landscape is a character. So for me, I have two types of research. One is what I call head research or book research, which is archives, libraries, museums, reading around the subject, being an historian, essentially, making sure all the dates are correct, all of these things that we've been talking about. But the other part of it is what I call foot research, and that is being there. And of course, I can't be in the place that would become Cape Town in 1688. I can't be in Stellenbosch in 1688. I can't be in Franschhoek in 1688. But I can be there now and see the ghost of those early cities beneath the buildings and the roads and the pavements that are there now. And is the extraordinary sky the same? Yes. Is the light the same? Pretty much. The vegetation, the mountains, the very high winds, the hot air, all of these things. So it's about being there and feeling that it's the same sun that is shining on me that would have shone on Suzanne in 1688 or Isabel in 1862. And out of that, it's as if, there's a moment in Star Wars where Leia kind of holds something up and there's a kind of a hologram comes up. For me, that's what it feels like, that the more I'm there, the more I do the research, the more that from dust comes the earlier city. And once I have that, my characters can walk in between the streets and all of those things. So it's very, very important to me. I don't know South Africa well. I have a lot of South African friends. I have been there quite a lot, but I've only ever been there for, 2 weeks at a time.
Yes.
But when I've been there, I've been in the Franschhoek Mountains. I've been walking through Stellenbosch, seeing all the extraordinary oak trees that were planted, looking at the river, seeing the redness in the water, all of these kind of things. And that's how I bring a place to life.
And I actually watched a video on your Instagram the other day, and you were doing a video of a graveyard and saying that anybody who reads your books will know your kind of fascination with them. And I was curious, were you visiting any graveyards for this book?
Oh yes, absolutely. The moment there are two graveyards. There's a kind of unconsecrated graveyard with some tombs and headstones in it in Franschhoek, which is just behind, in a road that runs parallel to Huguenot Road. So it's just behind the original church and all of those kind of things, with the mission bell and beautiful white Cape Dutch, as the architecture is called. But then there is also the graveyard in the Huguenot Memorial Museum, which, the Memorial Museum was built from a house that was already there. It was turned from there. And I spent a lot of time, my screensaver on my desktop and indeed my laptop is that graveyard in Franschhoek, because there is, it's that wonderful line from the Philip Larkin poem, Churchgoing. And I'm paraphrasing, but the idea that whatever your views about faith, whether you have one or not, or whatever tradition you were brought up in, whether you were Jewish or Muslim, or Sikh or Christian or an atheist, whatever, there is something about standing in a place in a graveyard, thinking of all the people that lie in that dust. It connects you to humanity and everybody who's gone before, and the fact that one day that will be you. In a pragmatic sense, graveyards are the best way for getting good, appropriate local names.
Yes.
Because if you walk around a graveyard, after a while, you will notice that there's a lot of people who are called de Villiers or Joubert or Jourdain. So graveyards are living history in an ironic sort of a way. So yes, I spent a lot of time lurking in Franschhoek graveyards for this book. And, when Isabel, there is a scene with, in the 19th century when Isabel is standing there, I would say that when I was writing that scene, that was the moment for me, before I'd even dreamt about writing these series of books, that it began. I just imagined a woman standing in front of a grave and reaching out to get to rub away the lichen, to see a name, and that would confirm everything she knew or everything she didn't know. And that was the first visual image I had for this whole series of books, being in the graveyard in Franschhoek.
I mean, I've always perceived graveyards as quite creepy places, but actually, listening to you now, they're so rich with history, that actually it's the perfect place to kind of. I'm saying this because my friend Emma Hines is a writer, and she.
Oh, I know her. Yes.
Yes, and she took me on a walk through a graveyard once, and I was like, "Why are we doing this?" And she said it's the perfect place for inspiration. So yeah, hearing you talk about it, maybe I need to go and revisit a graveyard.
Well, they are very peaceful places, and
Yes.
also for all of us, and everybody listening, they are places of stories. That's the thing. A graveyard is a place of stories.
Yes.
So what's not to like?
Yes, that's very true. Now, I'm very conscious of time. I know you're a very busy woman, but my last question on the book has to be that this has, of course, been a 12-year project for you. What are the things that you've learned from this experience? What are you kind of taking away with you? What have you learned and enjoyed?
It has been wonderful planning and discovering the history of one family. I've never done that in quite the same sort of way before. And the lead character that we meet when she's a young woman, when she first sees the man that will become her husband, and she's walking through the misty streets in February 1562 of Carcassonne, and suddenly there is this moment of crisis. And she is called Minou Joubert. And to have spent so much time with this character has been wonderful. And then her descendants, because it is the story of the strength of women, generation after generation after generation. The stories that women tell one another, the way that they keep women's stories alive, but also very importantly, that there are different shapes of family, because this is not mother to daughter only. It is mother to granddaughter. It is granddaughter to aunt, to friend, to make new forms of families. And I think one of the reasons I found the very final pages of this book so moving to write, it was the possibility of saying with the last character that we know, Isabelle Lepard Schubert, that life moves on and there are different types of stories within a family that could be told. And a woman doesn't have to be a mother to be telling the stories that matter. And I'm a mother and I love that. And I was lucky enough for that to happen. And I'm now a granny, but I don't believe that these are the only stories. And that for me is really important, writing all kinds of women into history, not just stories of motherhood or romantic love. And so the series of books, particularly The Ghost Ship, of course, is full of different sorts of love affairs, women with women, men with men, everything that we would now see of as modern has always happened in every country under the sun. And I think that has been the biggest lesson of this, that you can write different sorts of love stories and they are just as valid.
Absolutely. I did say I'd give no spoilers, and I will continue to give no spoilers, but the ending of the book made me cry because it is
excellent.
it's so powerful. And you really showed with that ending, how we are as a woman, we're in conversation with the women that came before us, and I just thought it was so powerful, and I'm just so glad that I got to read it. And this book, The Map of Bones, is, when this episode goes live, it'll be out tomorrow, published by Mantle. I'm going to pop a link in the show notes for the listeners to order themselves a copy. Go do that. You will not regret it. Before I let you go, Kate, I love to end on a recommendation. So is there anything that you would like to recommend to my listeners?
If you are a writer listening to this and you are thinking about storytelling and how to develop characters, you can do no better than watch all of Grey's Anatomy produced by the wonderful Shonda Rhimes, because Shonda Rhimes knows how to tell a story, and that way of how you develop a character, having women's stories at the heart of things, having a balance of the politics in the real world, but without ever overwhelming the narrative drive. There is nobody better than Shonda Rhimes and her writers on Grey's Anatomy. So I recommend that to you wholeheartedly.
I am so happy that you've recommended Grey's Anatomy. I've never had that recommendation.
There
and
you
it is
go.
my favourite series. It's incredible, and Shonda Rhimes is incredible. And I would also recommend her book, Year of Yes. It's amazing. And she's amazing, as are you, Kate. Thank you so much for your time today and for this wonderful book. I've absolutely loved chatting to you. And yeah, it's just been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to rate, review and subscribe. And if you want to give me a follow, you can do so at A Pair of Bookends Pod on Instagram and at A Pair of Bookends on Twitter and TikTok. I should ask Kate, where can they find you on social media?
Yes, you can find me on Instagram as Kate Mosse Writer. You can find me on Threads as well, and also on Facebook as Kate Mosse Author. But all the information about my books and my tour is on my website, which is www.katemosse.co.uk.
I will link all of those in the show notes. Thank you so much once again, Kate, and thank you, listeners, for listening. Bye.
Bye.